Hey folks, David Stewart here. In the past, I've talked about my Storycraft pyramid, setting, characters, and plot, and how those things interact with one another and are dependent upon one another to produce an effective story. Now I'd like to talk about the flip side of that, which is the pyramid of effect. And that is really the result of the story, how it affects the audience. I think the goal of any piece of art is to produce some sort of state change in whoever is consuming that art, whether it's a movie or a book or a painting on the wall. You want to affect them in some way. You either want to make them react or care about something, you want to make them think after the fact or while the art is taking place. All art, for me, for my evaluation purposes, and this is usually what forms the basis for my analyses and my criticisms, is whether or not the piece of work is effective. If the work isn't effective, if it's meaningless, if it creates no state change in me, that to me is usually a bad piece of art. Then, of course, I should point out there are pieces of art, there are works that produce unintentional effects. So if you watch something like The Room, which is a really, really bad movie, its failures become its own state changing device. So it's effective because of its failures. It becomes like so bad it's good. It becomes hilariously bad. And that's an interesting thing. It is an effect. It doesn't make the movie good because I don't think that was the intentional effect of the producers of the movie, but it does have an effect that's rather bizarre because of its failures. So there are things like that that end up having an effect. So let me talk about this pyramid down here, the effect pyramid. And just like how there's a hierarchy between setting, characters, and plot, the characters live in the setting, so the setting has to be a firm foundation for the characters to exist. The plot is hopefully acted out by the characters, and if you don't have these things working well together, then you're probably not going to be writing a story that is going to be as effective as it could be. So just like that, there's a hierarchy to the effects that occur in a particular piece of art, a particular work. And to me, the bottom level one is what I call reacting. Reacting is within the moment, and it's actually a fairly easy thing to do, is to get reactions from people. So if you have if you're watching a movie and a dinosaur pops out and roars at the screen, and you might like jump back in your seat and feel a jolt of surprise and fright. That's that base level. That's a reacting, and it tends to be pretty easy. You can create some tension and then resolve it, or you can just do something out of the blue and surprise people. And as we're looking at the relationship between these two, these pyramids should really be inverted. Reacting is related to plot. So if you imagine that there's an even bigger pyramid that creates the effect, the quality of your plot, your event sequence, tends to produce that reacting level. So you want to have a good plot because you want to have that basic thing down. When you're reading something like Game of Thrones and you turn the page and there's like a surprise murder, or a character does something really unexpected, a character comes upon a situation that wasn't expected at all, that's a reaction thing. And that base level, depending on how effective it is, it can really get people involved. If you don't have that base level, if you're not making people react to what's happening in the story, it's very, very difficult to make them care about the characters, which is the next level up. And this is where I think the most effective stories, the most popular stories, I should say, the ones that really stand the test of time and are beloved by people and go on to make lots of money, they're really hitting this middle part of the pyramid really hard. They are making people care about the outcomes of the story, care about the characters. Spend time talking to fans of any genre, and they'll talk about some of their favorite characters and why they're their favorite characters, and how bad it felt maybe when that character died, or when the character did something they didn't want it to do, and how frustrated they felt when they're reading that. So there's a interaction between those two. You care about the outcomes of the characters, and then through the execution of the plot, you can make an audience member have even further and more effective reactions to what you're doing. And at the top is the thinking part. And this is actually one of the hardest ones to achieve, is to make people, after they turn the movie off, after they put the book down, after they walk away from a painting, stop and think about what was contained in that painting or in that piece of art or in that album that they listened to. They're thinking about the ideas. So if you think reacting tends to be events, caring tends to be personal, and thinking tends to be about ideas. And so it's really like an inversion there. The plot creates most of the reactions, the characters create most of the caring, and the setting tends to be a lot of the thought. And different genres have different focuses on each of these levels, but if you ignore any of the levels, you're probably missing out on making your story as good as it could be for your audience. And indeed, I think the best books, the best stories that have really stood the test of time and become classics are those that the effect is all of these levels in a really profound way. And that is usually the result of a very effective story pyramid as well. So if you think of a genre like horror, horror is master, a good horror producer, a good horror movie writer, or a good horror book writer is a master of making people react. It's a master of the plot sequence happening to create tension and then resolve that tension either through a surprise or through nothing happening sometimes. So that tends to be a genre that's very good at making people react, but not necessarily making people care. You might care about the characters in a horror movie, or you might not care about them, but the reactions are probably still going to be there. And it's a rare circumstance where you have a horror movie that's capable of making you think about it and is really engaging your brain and is really presenting ideas that have an effect on you. So horror tends to be like that. If you think of really popular explosive types of fiction, whether it's Star Wars or it's Harry Potter, it tends to really hit that middle category really hard. So space opera tends to be a lot more about caring, if you want to compare it to really anything. Fantasy and space opera tend to be more about caring. It's character driven. It's the characters that are really hitting it hard. And then when you get to a genre like sci-fi, sci-fi really wants to make you think about the ideas that are in it, at least classic sci-fi. I think more modern sci-fi is closer to space opera. It's trying to make you care about characters. It's trying to make you react. But say the work of Philip K. Dick, who's a master at making people think about his ideas. But you probably wouldn't be thinking about Philip Dick's ideas, regardless of what story of his you're reading, if he wasn't also very good at making you care about the outcome of the characters and having you react to surprising things and interesting things happening in the plot sequence. So Philip K. Dick's stories are great because they have that story pyramid going on, and then they therefore produce all different levels. So science fiction has the potential and tends to be the focus on making people think about ideas, but chances are your audience is not going to end up thinking about those ideas if you can't pull them through some kind of good story. And fantasy tends to be basically the same as space opera. It can be character driven, but there's also some fantasy, at least classic fantasy, tends to involve a lot more higher order ideas that makes you think about it. And fantasy, whereas science fiction tends to focus on like man and technology and the consequences of technology, fantasy tends to focus on moral and ethical problems that characters have. Really big epic fantasy tends to be about epic ideas. So if I think about some of the classic works of literature that almost everyone would end up agreeing is a good book, at least on some level. If I take like To Kill a Mockingbird as an example, To Kill a Mockingbird is actually a very effective story on all three levels. And it's effective because it's a well-written story that has a setting that's well exposed. The characters definitely live within that setting, and the plot is original, it's surprising, and it's enacted by the characters in a way that the characters would actually act it out. So you care about the outcomes of the characters. You're reacting to the surprises in the plot. Like there's a big surprise. You really want Atticus to get the guy off at trial, and it doesn't happen. And that's a big reaction. That's a big letdown. And that letdown was only heightened because you cared about the outcome for Atticus and for his client, whose name escapes me for some reason right now. And at the same time, the ideas that are presented in it about racism, about the nature of culture in the South, pre-Jim Crow, those things that you think about once you put the book down, that's one of the reasons that To Kill a Mockingbird is a classic book. It's one of the reasons that almost everyone will want you to read it at some point, why English professors assign the book so much, or English teachers at the high school level feel so safe assigning the book, is because it does those things well enough that it's thought of as a classic. If you think about something like Lord of the Rings, which is one of my favorite works, Lord of the Rings is very good at producing all three. There's a plot sequence where there's reacting, there's unexpected things that happen. Certainly, the first time I read it, I was shocked when Gandalf fell into the hole and died, right? When the Balrog killed him. Spoilers, if you haven't read Lord of the Rings or haven't seen the movies. So that is it's a very effective sequence. But the effect is only heightened by the fact that I really cared about that character, and I really cared about his outcomes. The surprise, the tension of the drum sounding in the deep in Moria, that's a reaction level thing. But when it came to the surprising ending for Gandalf, it's because I cared. At the same time, the entire story, that's just one of the many things that happen in the book that have a good effect like that. But the entire work is centered around some really big moral ideas. The nature of power, the corrupting nature of power, which is the prime theme of the book, and there's multiple themes. That you put that book away and you think about how when somebody takes up power, they're taking up a ring of power, and it affects them, it changes them. They stop becoming a good person and they start becoming something different. And you can see that with people who gain political power, or people who gain prestige, or social power and things like that. So it's a deep theme that crosses multiple cultures and multiple backgrounds, which is why the movies are so beloved world over, and why the books have been translated into so many different languages. It's a universal and big idea that makes a big statement. And there's more themes than that end up provoking a lot of thought. The idea of, you have there's ideas of government versus anarchy. There's ideas of people being helpless versus finding strength within themselves, and that's because that setting characters and plot work well. You really care about the outcomes of the characters, which pulls you through the whole story. And to see at the very end of the story, Frodo, this character you care about, end up succumbing to the temptation of power, is a very, very effective moment where everything's firing, and you can really see what Tolkien was writing about, not just from characters, not just from the setting, the world he had created in his head, but the ideas that affected his soul and his mind on a deep level that he was expressing through those books. That's why those are classics. Another classic book, 1984, which is to me one of my favorite books, and I think actually one of the best books that you could read, is hyper effective all the way through the book. And it's because the setting is so well developed and fleshed out. The characters are such a part of the setting, and there's such a good effort of exposing those and teaching the reader what's going on, and then the plot sequence and the events that happen, and the way they happen, and the outcomes, being totally unexpected and different from what you want them to be, ends up creating a really interesting story. And of course, all the ideas in it that created everything, right? That created everything that you're seeing in the book. The ideas really created the plot. You end up stopping and thinking about the ideas. I've made multiple videos on the ideas in 1984 because they're so profound and interesting. The manipulation of language, the changing of language, the idea that you can program someone to believe what you want them to believe, the idea that you can change people's thought processes, all of those things which were profound and scary ideas just make the story that much better. So those are three examples in, I guess, three different genres, literary fiction, science fiction, and fantasy, that I think are great examples of the effect. If you want to think about effective movies, they can happen as genre movies, or they can happen outside of genre movies. I'm sure you can think of lots of them. One of the most effective sci-fi movies that I remember is Blade Runner, because it was based on a Philip K. Dick story, and the ideas were great. And although it doesn't bear too much resemblance to Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep in terms of its story construction, the ideas are still there. And it's a movie that, especially when you watch the director's cut and it's not resolved at the end and it leaves you with a question, that invokes that higher level thing. You're thinking like, well, could you really know if you were if you were programmed or not. And we have these questions that continue to go on, like, are we living in a simulation, something like that? Would we really know if we'd been programmed to feel this way, or been programmed to think that we're alive when we're not? There's lots of those questions that happen. So that's a good example of a movie. I'm sure you can think of many more that hit all these really, really hard and do them well. If we want to think of Star Wars, because I know there's a lot of Star Wars fans that watch this channel, where Star Wars is most effective with this pyramid is in that second movie. It's in Empire Strikes Back, because the first movie, you really care about the outcome of the characters, and it's an exciting movie. It's a roller coaster ride. It makes you react. It makes you care. Doesn't make you do that much thinking. But when you get to the second movie, that's when a lot of the thinking happens, because you have these conversations between Yoda and Luke Skywalker that are talking about the nature of this mystical force, the dark side and the light side, and characters are actually making decisions that have unexpected outcomes. And I think that's why Empire Strikes Back is usually considered the best Star Wars movies, because it makes people not just care, not just feel, not just react, but to think about the ideas that are present in what's there. And that's a good example as well. So hopefully this has been interesting to you, and you've enjoyed it on some level. Leave me your thoughts down below and let me know what you think about effect. This is the basis for most of my analysis and most of my criticism, and tends to be the main way that I evaluate how good or how bad a piece of art is how well it's able to communicate effect, how well it's able to change the state of the audience. So thanks so much, and I will see you guys next time.